This video is going to be about the software differences between Texas schools and Swedish schools. As a result of some details in this one's going to get a little crunchy. So once I start getting to the I'll try to do the soft parts first and get to the crunchy parts a little bit later, because some of you are interested in the crunch and some of you just want some comparisons. Dash, what are you doing, bro? What do you do with your ears? That's going to distract people. Okay, so the differences in American schools, Texas schools, because again, this is one of the things that's hugely different that people in Sweden don't understand, is that the U.S. does not have a unified education system. We technically have the Department of Education, but the people in charge of that are quite often people who hate public education and are trying to destroy it. Fortunately, it has so little power that it doesn't have any sort of way to enforce the things that it suggests. When I became disillusioned with the American school system was when I found out that Texas was required to offer a computer science program in Texas. And I got computer science certification specifically so that I could teach kids computer science, because I wanted to teach them how to code and because that's something super useful. And I approached my school district with it and I was like, hey, you sent me to this conference. I learned how to do this. Do you want me to get this actual certification so that we can start offering computer science? And they were like, well, it's required by law, but there's no punishment if we don't. And computer science, even though it's required by law, doesn't give us extra money from the state. Whereas if we have those same kids in a welding class, then we get extra money from the state. So instead of offering them things that will be useful to them in the future, we're going to keep offering them welding. And these kids will just have a bunch of welders because we get paid more from the state, and forget them having higher level jobs like computer coding or programming, because basically we don't get money for that. So that was an initial level. That's pretty much what the nail in the coffin when I started going, wow, Texas education's fucking bullshit. And don't get me wrong, I recognize the capitalist viewpoint in that, and that it's just, you know, whatever makes us money, that's what we're going to do. But I was frustrated because I specifically went out of my way to learn this other thing and to actually start learning coding myself, which I have no interest in. And because that's the thing, there are people who are really good at it, and my mind doesn't work that way. I have to actually force it to work that way. So I got frustrated because my little school district was like, well, we're not going to follow the law because they're not going to force us, and we can make more money this other way. Which for me, education should not be about money. Education should be about what's good for the kids, what's good for the future, what will help our kids succeed. So I was very frustrated about that. But that isn't the only way that American education is different. As I mentioned, I believe in the previous video, you're stuck in the same place for years, over a decade even. Because if your parents aren't rich and you can't afford private school, in the US you are stuck going to the local public school, which is tied to a tax district. And so in Sweden, if you're bullied, you can change schools. In the US, you can't do that. You're just stuck with the same people, which means if you have bullies or insidious stuff, there's no way to get away from it at all. What's worse is that poor school districts quite often have less money to pay teachers, less money for equipment, less money for keeping the buildings up to code, less money for clean bathrooms, less money for quality stuff. And in the US, there's lots of people who, in Texas, there's lots of people who complain about the Robin Hood laws, which make it to where rich school districts have to give some of their money to poor school districts. And the problem is that if you don't use the money immediately, next year you will get less money. There's actually a fascinating Star Trek episode about this from back in the day. Basically, and it's part of the problem we have with the bloated U.S. military as well, where if you don't spend the money in a fiscal year, if you save it for later, then the next year you get less money. So a lot of people in the U.S. complain, especially in rich school districts, why should my money be going to helping the poors in another district? And that's a problem that we have over there, because a lot of people in rich school districts don't give a fuck about anybody outside of their district. So there are laws in place in Texas, although there are certain powers working very hard to remove those laws, because who cares about the poors? But specifically in the U.S., the biggest difference is the difference between gymnasiums and high schools. Gymnasiums, if you don't know, if you're not here from the Swedish side, are specifically, they are themed, if you will. So like a science gymnasium, you have a focus on science. You specifically, like all of your classes are kind of geared towards science. When you have English classes, they probably have some higher level vocabulary that is science specific. If you have Swedish classes, you're learning a bunch of stuff like that. If you have medical classes or math classes, those are tied into measurement and actual applicable scientific. It's a higher level of math. But you also have schools here where it's just you learn how to ride and take care of horses, or you learn how to do veterinary stuff. Or the school I worked at was one where you learned practical trade skills. So we had things like mullery, painting, design, textile, and finsnickery, where you would learn how to shape wood in a way to make fancy furniture. And a lot of this stuff is very, very useful. And so what we would try to do on the theory side is we would try to make the language something that would be useful to the students. So if they worked with somebody who only spoke English, then they would have an option to speak English about their tools or about the processes of the class. And so each school type in Sweden, you're with other people who have the same interests as you, or at least have some interest in this thing. So like if you're a painter, you're with other painters. If you're going to be a scientist, you're with other scientists. If you're a coder, you're going to be with other people who like computers. If you're in an art school, you're going to have theater kids and song kids, choir kids, band kids, all these music people together. So you can have a lot more of a social gathering, and you can actually be involved with others. And it's awesome. It's a great thing to do in Sweden. It's wonderful, and I'm not sure it would work in the U.S. just because our structures are so bullshit. But high school in the U.S. is really just more Grundskola. It's the same classes, required of the same people. One of the main differences between the U.S. and Sweden is that in the U.S. we have leveled classes. So, for example, if you have a group of 8th graders in Sweden, year 8s, they all take the same math, and they will be mixed according to, you know, what's easier for the teachers and how many are in a class, etc. But if you have 8th graders in the U.S., you'll be divided. You'll have 8th graders who do rudimentary math, Violet. You'll have 8th graders who are not very good at math. You'll have, and they'll be in a class by themselves, specifically focused on making them able to pass math. Or you'll have 8th graders who are really good at math, and they'll be in a special class just for the really good kids. This separation has value because you can teach some kids faster and they can learn more, but it also has serious social implications, and that's bad. The Swedish way is probably better. I haven't done much actual research on it, because when I first got here, it was very, very frustrating to have to slow down the class for some students and have the higher level students become behavioral issues because I had to slow down the class for some of the students. Now, the longer I've been here, the better I've gotten at going, okay, I'm going to get this group started, then I'm going to go over to this group, then I'm going to hit this group, and that way I'm able to keep it balanced in the classroom. But that is a skill set I didn't have when I moved here. Because in the U.S., we really do just keep the classes separated. The problem is that can cause a lot of self-esteem issues, especially for people in the lower class. And it can cause some weird social dynamics because teenagers are mean to each other. Getting into one more thing before I get into the crunchy, really weird, detailed stuff. One of the other major things in the U.S. is that we don't do national tests the way that you do. We don't do subject-based national tests. Our national tests are general knowledge, usually. We do subject-based tests, but they're never comprehensive, and they happen over so much time that... Let me take back what I just said. It's not that we don't have national tests. It's that we have so many tests that they seem unfocused. They seem like a scattershot kind of thing. We do have tests that are specific to subjects. We do have tests that are based on grade levels. But in Sweden, you guys take, I want to say, like 15 national tests total. And in the US, we take 112. So it's just an insane level of too many tests. And most of them are just sitting there filling in bubbles. And don't get me wrong, we have made a way where it's not easy. Because quite often our bubble tests will have 2 right answers, but one is more right than the other. And that's the one you have to select to get any points. So our tests are built to trick our students. And unfortunately, one of the things about the tests in the US is while the learning is student-focused, the tests are teacher-focused. Because it's much easier to run a set of Scantrons through a machine and it grade them than for you to actually sit down and read an essay or read a short answer or read and give students partial credit. So we built stuff because we exhaust our teachers in the US, because we overwork them, because they don't have enough time. We have built a system to make the grading part more efficient, and it's inherently destructive to teachers and students. It basically takes a hammer to education because we're in such a hurry, because our teachers are so overworked that they don't have time to give proper feedback. And as a learner of Swedish, I have realized how fucking important feedback is. If you actually want to improve, if you actually want to learn anything, and it's not something you can learn entirely on your own, feedback is so important. It's absolutely necessary for the growth of a student. But in the US, we just didn't have time. We had so many students, we had so many classes, we had so much extra work to do that we didn't have time to grade. And so we didn't, most of the time. Most of the time, even when we did national test grading that had essays, we would send it off to people who would have 30 seconds to give an entire essay a grade. And so instead of actually grading on its merits, you would grade it on, did it follow the formula? Does it have this, this, and this, and this that you are required to have? Okay, done, A. And even then, we've had to move away from that monopoly because it was one company doing all of our grading for all of our national tests. And they had a monopoly. And the problem was, because they were a company and not educators, they would be like, we've got too many A's. You need to bump some of these A's down to B's. Or all of these essays should be C's, but we need some A's to make this balance the bell curve, so we're going to move them. That's a regular problem in the US that I have seen, is what we call curving. In the US, we have a higher standard, technically. than the UK and Sweden and this part of the world. Because over here, usually a 50 is passing. If you get half the questions on a thing right, you pass. But in the US, we say that the grades that pass start at 70. But the problem is 70 is malleable. Sometimes when we teach in the US, we will give what's called a curve, where we're like, okay, 2/3 of the class failed this. I'm going to give everybody so many points so that more than half of the class will barely pass. And those people who got C's will jump up to B's or A's. And therefore, it's a better spread for my class. Because I shouldn't blame the lower level people when I clearly failed them as a teacher. Because I failed to teach more than half of them how to pass. So we do that, and that's not even considered cheating. It's not. There are teachers who get in trouble for cheating, but curving is not cheating, which is insane. Coming over here and seeing that you guys have a much more reasonable level of set, it makes me look back and go, yeah, we just cheated all the time, didn't we? And don't get me wrong, I don't blame myself at the time for doing it, because when the system's broke, you shouldn't have to follow the rules. So, let's get into some of the crunchy shit now. So, what I'm going to talk about now is grading specifically. So, grading specifically in Sweden, it's very subjective. The individual teacher gives a grade based on a set of subjective criteria. And those criteria are usually very simple. So, like, for example, I'm going to read the English version of the LGR 22 grading criteria for English 9. The student listens and participates in showing understanding of common words and simple phrases in clearly spoken, simple language at a slow pace on familiar topics. The student participates in reading some common words and very simple phrases in short, simple texts on familiar topics. That's 1. 2, in oral presentations of various kinds, the student participates in formulating himself simply with words and phrases. The student also participates in writing simple words and phrases. That's 2. 3, in interaction, student participates in expressing himself simply with words and phrases. That's 3. And the student contributes to commenting in English on conditions in different contexts and areas where the language is used. That's 4. There are 4 qualifiers for English at year 9. That's it. And because there's only 4, we can check those multiple times throughout the year. We can check them over and over and over again. And we can give the student the best of their work becomes their grade. So if a student can consistently get C level, but when they're not stressed, we see them work at an A level, we can give them an A level. In Sweden, it is also, we're not just grading assignments. In the US, we only grade assignments. In Sweden, we can grade how they're doing in class, how they're working with others. Are they a classroom leader? Are they showing this when it's not on paper? In the US, we are not allowed to judge student ability separate from assignments. And that is a huge an important distinction. Because if I see a student who can sit there and do their homework perfectly, but they get stressed at test and they come in and they fail the test, they still fail the class. Now, every now and then you'll have a teacher who is paying enough attention where they'll have them do a retest under special circumstances, or they'll have them do extra credit or whatever it is to get them to pass. But in Sweden, that's built into the system. In Sweden, if I see a student contribute to commenting in English on conditions and different contexts and areas where the language is used, that's fine. That's a grade. Also in the US, because we have a bunch of teachers and because we don't trust our teachers, that is the hugest difference between Sweden and the US, is the basic competency of teachers. Several places that I worked in the US, a math teacher did not know what a verb was. Didn't have any fucking idea. This is a person who went to college for at least 4 years. They had no idea what a verb or an adjective was. No fucking clue. The history teachers did not know how to grade an essay. The English teachers couldn't add up their grades. That's how bad at math they were. Adding. They couldn't add up 10 grades. Whereas in Sweden, teachers are assumed, and generally are, competent. Teachers are assumed to actually at least have passed college, and so know enough about other subjects to where an English teacher and a math teacher can talk. In the US, some teachers could not leave the area of their hallway because they didn't have anything to say to teachers of a different subject. We have something in the US that my wife and I have taken to calling educational incest. And it's where a teacher lives in an area for so long that their students become teachers and come back to that area and teach the same thing that they were taught. And it can go for generations. You can have one teacher teach 3 generations of other students. Those students go off to college, move back home, move back in their old room, start teaching in that school the same way that they learned. They don't bring anything new back. It's just the same over and over and over again. And that's not a thing in Sweden. There's a horrible thing in Sweden that's frustrating, but at least it beats this particular pitfall. In Sweden, you can't get a raise unless you change jobs. You get a basic raise based on union rates, which doesn't keep up with inflation. And you will have new teachers getting paid more than teachers who have been there for 5 years. That's just how Sweden works. But it does encourage people to move on so you don't have that level of educational incest. Anyway, sorry, that was a digression. So in Sweden, you have those 4 things. You check them lots of times. Now, let's go look at the TAC. That's the Texas Educational Standards for English. For knowledge and skills in Texas Educational Standards, there are 11 headings, and most of them have 7 or 8 things underneath them. Developing and sustaining foundational language skills, listening, speaking, discussion, and thinking oral language. The student develops oral language through listening, speaking, and discussion. The student is expected to A, engage in meaningful and respectful discourse by listening actively, responding appropriately, and adjusting communication to audience and purposes. B, follow and give complex oral instructions to perform specific tasks, answer questions, solve problems, complex processes. C, give a presentation using informal, formal, and technical language, expected to meet the needs of an audience, purpose, and occasion, employing eye contact, speaking rate, such as pauses for effect, volume, enunciation, purposeful gestures, and conventions of language to communicate ideas effectively. And D, participate collaboratively, building on the ideas of others, contributing relevant information, developing a plan for consensus building, and setting ground rules for decision-making. That is one of 12 headings. Additional headings include developing and sustaining foundational language skills, developing blah, 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 comprehension skills, response skills. None of these are just the words I'm using. They cover paragraphs. But I'm not going to read you whole paragraphs. I'm just going to tell you that in English, you would check in the course of a year 110 knowledge things. So each of these, you're not going to have time to test these more than once, most of them. Most of them are going to come up once in one assignment. And in English and Swedish, you only check 4 things. Even if you were to divide each of those 4 things into 2 or 3 parts like I do, you can still only check those. You can check them 6 or 7 times. In America, in Texas, we can only check these things once. Most of them only come up once. And they get so specific that it's like examine sources for credibility and bias, including omission, faulty reasoning, such as ad hominem, loaded language, slippery slope. Yes, we do all that in Sweden, but it falls under one of those 4 things. Shell critique. In this, shell critique has 15 points underneath it. And I have to cover each and every one of those to be able to give a student credit. Because in the US, they don't trust teachers. They keep giving them more things to do. They keep making them responsible for not only the raising of the child, the way the child talks, the way the child behaves, the way the child blah, blah, blah. We get all these extra requirements, just like American cops. I'm not sure all American cops used to be bad. I'm not sure that's always been the case. They've often been abusive. But the more shit we give them to do, and the fact that we keep taking away mental health resources, we keep taking away all these other things that would support proper policing and make them the job of a beat cop who trains 6 weeks. It's ridiculous. And so we expect our teachers to do everything, but we also don't trust them to do anything. And so every teacher has to hit all of these knowledge requirements because we don't trust the education that gives us our teachers. We don't go, okay, well, all of these things fit under one of these things in the Swedish system. And that's the problem. We don't trust our teachers in the US. It's the biggest thing. Now, let's go to math because math's even more crunchy. So math, you only have 4 things that you check. Again, describing mathematical concepts and connections, choosing and using mathematical methods, solving problems, using symbols. That's the 4 things in math. And in Swedish math, you check 6 different concepts each year. You have the ability to make equations, you have the ability of geometry, you have algebra, geometry, fractions of fractions, decimals, and other ways to do stuff. Actually expressing mathematics through operations. And then statistics and the weird shit. And so you cover all those things each year and you add a little bit to the concepts. Initially, it might be just being able to recognize fractions. Being able to go, that's a fraction. That's a whole number. Done. And each year you come back to each of these things. Whereas in the US, you have 9th grade. 9th grade is algebra. That's all it is. Just algebra all year. Everything is algebra. The next year, you have geometry. Geometry uses some concept from algebra, but the entire year is focused on geometry. So basically, if you miss something at the beginning of the year, the rest of the year is lost. Whereas in Sweden, because it's in little bite-sized chunks, you can just reteach one of those chunks, and it's no problem dragging somebody forward a little bit. But not only that, you've got those 4 things that you're checking. And in Sweden, those 4 things are all of your math. In math, in algebra, again, you have these headings. There are 12 headings in algebra. Each one has subheadings, about 6 of them. So you might say linear functions, equations, and inequalities. And then it has 8 things they have to be able to do. Now, we don't have time to do this in the US. Also, in math classes in the US, we had a certain number of required grades. So we had 6-week grading periods. And in that 6-week grading period, you need 2 tests and 8 daily grades. So each week, you needed 1.5 daily grades, which means a quiz, because you can't grade homework. Because homework will never be done by every person. One person will do the homework, and everybody else will copy it. And I know that because I taught in many schools in Texas, and every single school I had horrible problems with cheating. Most of the schools in Sweden, I've had horrible problems with cheating. And I'll tell you about how to beat cheating on tests in Sweden in a second. But You send home homework, one person will do it, 8 people will copy. Now, even if you tell them, I'm not grading the homework, they will still do that. Even if you tell them, I just want to see that you tried, they will still just copy each other. It's just how it works. And this is true in the US and Sweden. So you can't grade homework because you never know who did it. Even if the student doesn't copy off of other students, lots of students have their parents do it. Lots of students have their older brother do it, who's an engineering student. Lots of students have, just some rando that they found on the internet answer these questions. Or they find something that answers all of them for you. Even if you make them up, which I usually do, the answers are on there. And the thing is, the point is not the answers. Most of the books that you have, they will teach you, they will say, here's the problem, at the back are the answers. And that's good. As a teacher, I want them to be able to check. I want them to be able to know if they got the right answer, because if they do the problems and they don't get any sort of feedback, including the right answer, then they haven't learned anything until they get to class and I just like, okay, all these are wrong. How useful is that? It's much better to give them the answer and have them work backwards. But the problem is there are a lot of students, and this is true again in Sweden and the US, who they think that the assignment is the point. They think that if they finish the assignment, then they have learned. They have succeeded. And it's very hard to make people understand that the assignment is to teach you something. The assignment is there so that you can learn this thing that you can then use in a different way. Finishing this set of problems doesn't equal grade. Finishing this set of problems is there so that you can... Wow. I love the sun, but it is messing me up here. Finishing the assignment is so that you can learn the stuff that you need for the test. Finishing the test isn't the point either. The point is you're supposed to learn these concepts and how to use them so that you can apply them in any situation in which they might be useful. And there are situations where some of them are useful, and there are situations where some of them will never come up again. But even then, the point of math class, aside from learning math, which some people will never use again, is to be able to follow complex instructions and know when to do something and when not to. Because every job in the world requires you to follow complex instructions. If you're making fries, it's important for you to make sure that the oil is a certain temperature before you stick the fries in there. Or the fries are going to be bad. And if you're going to make fries, I want you to make good fries. So if you don't know how to follow instructions, you're going to fail at everything forever. So the American school system, because it doesn't trust its teachers, because so many of its teachers aren't worthy of trust, because the standards are so low, because it's a desperately needed job that doesn't pay well. Because it's a job with no protections, with no support, and because everything in the US is so fucked, because a lot of people benefit from stupid people. A lot of people make money from the fact that other people are poorly educated. A lot of people succeed only because education sucks there. So it's profitable to keep people stupid. It's profitable not to actually know history. It's profitable to keep people not understanding statistics, keep paying into the lottery, keep getting payday loans, keep doing all of these things that only stupid people or uneducated people do. Those things are profitable to someone, and that someone can affect the government. That someone can give dark money to a government candidate to totally dismantle the public education system. That's perfectly legal. And that's the problem. Because in Sweden, you guys have realized that an educated populace is less likely to be affected by propaganda. It's less likely to be afraid. It's less likely to do stupid shit. It's less likely. And because you guys care about your society, I hope to say we care about our society enough that you want your people to be educated, because it follows that educated people are going to be better at their jobs. They're going to be better at defense. They're going to be better at voting. They're going to be better at everything that makes Sweden, Sweden. So you guys are willing to put in the effort. You're willing to make sure your teachers are of a certain level, and you keep people out. You keep some people out unfairly, but you make it to where it's so hard to be a teacher that all the people who make it have to reach a certain level. It's what you wanted to do with your driver's licenses. It doesn't work that way, but you know, it's what you wanted. So putting these gates makes it that, plus common sense grading. Your grading here makes so much more sense. So much more. Because as teachers, we see so much more than what is written on a test. We see so much more than was written on an assignment. We know when one of our really smart students isn't fucking trying. We know. It's obvious to us. Last year, I had the joy of having a student turn in what was clearly something they did not give a fuck about. But it was still high enough quality that I was able to ascertain that they deserved a B. So they got a B. Because that's how Swedish grades work. I'm like, you were able to talk in class. You actually had really good ideas that you developed slightly. This is a B paper. This would have been an A paper if you'd tried. And the look of shock in that student's face was awesome. It was awesome. Because in Sweden, you don't have to only grade what's on the piece of paper. And in the US, I was so frustrated. I was so frustrated to be giving students grades below what they deserved because of what was on a piece of paper. Because it encourages people to cram. It encourages people not to actually learn. It encourages people to not actively have value in education. And that's frustrating. That's frustrating as fuck. So, yeah. The biggest differences in the crunchy parts of American and Texan education. And again, I don't know about other states. I was not a teacher in more than one state. And every single state in the US has different standards for their teachers, has different standards for their students. Their most tests and requirements for tests. The thing I was telling you about the standards for math and English, those are just Texas. Texas Educational Knowledge Standards. That's it. We call them TEKS. We shorten it. TEKS. There's not a national version of that. When we tried to make a national version of math, and we called it Common Core, that would actually set people up to understand higher math better by making lower math just a little more difficult. If you make it just a little more difficult to learn lower math, then all these concepts can be inculcated and you can actually properly prepare students for higher level math. Because you get them thinking the right way. It's like trying to think in an algorithm. Coding is not hard once you understand the format. And getting people to think in algorithms, not hard if you catch them right. But in Texas, and in most of the United States, they rebelled against Common Core and said, no, we don't need this kind of math. Even if it makes us smarter later, we are not willing to invest time now. We are not willing to make math at the lower level even a little harder because fuck you and fuck the future. Because it needs to stay the same that I know so that my kid can't be smarter than me, which is fucking stupid. Because the American dream is that our kids will have it better than us. That is what it's supposed to be. And there are so many selfish fucking people out there that are, I got mine, you don't get yours. That's what's ruining the US. In my opinion. Anyway, there's a lot of teachers in America that think because something was hard for them, it should be hard for the children now. They think that because they had hardship, that hardship is what made them good. And it's not only a horrific mistake, it's just cruel and unnecessary. But that's just my opinion. I could be wrong. I have studied all this stuff, though. So if you guys have any more specific questions about this, especially the crunchy stuff, I really glossed over a lot of it. I have all this stuff easily accessed. It's not hard for me to pull up. So if you want something more on the crunchy stuff, let me know. I will be happy to explain it. Or if you just have general questions, if you guys have other things you'd like me to make videos on. I have feelings, strong feelings and opinions about so much shit. And some of it's interesting and some of it's not. I don't know what you guys want. So if you let me know, I will make videos. Nice to talk to you. Bye.